we're excited to have you. So welcome, Dr. Crawley.
Thank you, Ioana. Your voice started to spread out there, so I hope our audio is good. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. And I can only tell you that this dates back a long way for me, that I was immersed in bilingual education many years ago. And I'll probably, as I put my first photograph on here, if you guys can see me, you know that what quarantine or it's not quarantine, is it? But what COVID has done to me. And so I'd like to thank participants, but I think that you've mentioned all the names of some people that I had hoped would be with us today. But I really have to thank those people who've gone before me in this series. And to say that I remain eternally grateful to the contributions of my coworkers from back in that day, and to my professors and friends and teachers and elders and even the critics of our work who've made today's discussion possible. So I wrote this book because I realized that I had been uniquely positioned at the vortex of the powerful forces involved in the 30-odd years of federal support for American bilingual Indian education, for American bilingual education. And quite frankly, I did not want to see the knowledge that I had gained over those years disappear or frankly die with me. So I learned so much from my work of trying to implement a good program. It engaged every aspect of my training, and I found it so challenging that I wound up getting hooked on K-12 education for the remainder of my career. And I really do enjoy sharing these insights because they have really deep meaning for me. My book's intended audience is teachers and administrators, historians, academics, policymakers at all levels of governance, from local school boards to congressional representatives. It shares knowledge accumulated from a wide variety of interconnected multidisciplinary fields. And it was written, I think, without unnecessary academic jargon in order to appeal to that wide audience. As a product of my diverse background, I believe it contributes ideas that were not generally present in education coursework when I was in school and learning how to become a teacher. And since retirement from the 24/7 of school district superintending, I was able to commit these experiences to writing in anticipation that others will carry on the hard work of advocating for our children in all their diversity. So in that spirit, let me begin with some thoughts that I've chunked together into two major themes, but they emanate from one big question. And I think that question is, can understanding how social inequality reinvents itself through education policy and practice lead to greater social justice? And my two themes today are just simply the elements and the forces around bilingual education and what that CROW program was like back in the 70s and 80s when I was working there. And when roughly 3/4 of the CROW children were still coming to school with their first language as Crow, and many of them still speaking only Crow. My second theme of the day is this collection of lessons that I've learned along the way and my suggestions for their application in linguistic and culturally responsive education administration. Because as I've learned through my career, you always think that you can do more if you get higher in the organization, but what I've learned from that is all you really can do is influence other people because they're the ones that do it. And today, few Native American children come to school without some English today, but it is true that children are still being discriminated against for speaking the language of their respected elders, perhaps merely a non-standard dialect of English, but nonetheless, it is the most emotionally significant language of their lives, the language of their community and of their identity. For after skin color, language in the US is the greatest signifier of one's group identity. My own intellectual curiosity and language journey began with a German-speaking family that homesteaded in Montana back in the 1890s. And that the fact that they homesteaded there and that we went back to visit that old place when I was just a child led to a cross-cultural event in about 1950 that left such a dramatic impression on me that I think was probably some of the motivating force for what became my lifelong interests. I won't read it to you, I won't tell you about it right now, but I'll tell you that it opens the first chapter, or chapter, not the, it's actually the second chapter of the book, but it's chapter 1 in the book. And then suffice it to say that what I experienced that day, I came later to understand was a classic expression of hegemony. And I'm going to digress with this a little bit. I tried really hard to not have to use big words in this book because I wanted it to be accessible to people who are not academics. And I was afraid that this word hegemony was one of the words that would be a divider. But I found as I worked my way through all of this material that it just came up over and over again. So I'm going to take the time here to define it. And it is that influence or sense of authority that one group has over another group. And this is another important, I think, founding principle for me. It is that I believe that it's important that educators acknowledge and accept that the Euro-American education model in Indian country, even after the boarding school days were over, has been a colonial powers model designed to shape and assimilate students, not necessarily encouraging their higher educational aspirations. My own, I was fortunate to grow up in Bozeman, Montana, and I spent a lot of time at the Carnegie Library in Bozeman as a child, while both of my parents were working after school. And I actually came across Robert Lowy's works. Robert Lowy was an ethnographer who studied the Crow systems back in the early 1900s. And so between that and the fact that my grandmother told me stories about her Crow friends from when she was homesteaded down there right near the reservation, led also to this deep emotional connection I have to all of this work. After I got out of the library, I was able to walk just 6 blocks up the hill in Bozeman to go to MSU. And I majored at first in history, government, and philosophy and modern languages because I was always interested in language because my grandmother spoke German around us. Near the end of my college education, my parents said to me, if you don't get a piece of paper that says you can do something when you get out of college, we're going to be kind of disappointed in you. So I wound up adding the education coursework to be able to get a teaching degree out of that. And it served me really well. So I went on from that to living in Europe. And in Germany in Germany and later in Southeast Asia for quite some time, and doing some teaching that put me in bilingual settings, particularly when I was teaching English students and Chinese students in the same classroom in Southeast Asia. And I was given a 4th grade textbook for the Chinese students and a high school textbook for the English speaking students. And yet those Chinese students had a really big grasp of world events and so on. And I found myself inadequate to being able to bring them along the way they should have been able to be taught. That sent me, here's my Southeast Asia photo. Sorry, I'm getting behind. That sent me back to school, and this time to Berkeley. I'm going to go back to play from start and just flip through them. Does that work? Now you can see it?
Yep.
Okay, so now you know why I was talking about my hair in the second picture, right? And here's the book that I found was, I don't know, I didn't think it was easy at the time, but this morning it felt easier than writing a talk about it. So we'll see how this goes. And then my big question about understanding how social inequality reinvents itself through education policy and practice. My two themes, you guys have to see this wonderful young woman. And here's the log cabin that my grandparents lived in, and that area that we revisited when I had that amazing experience in 1950. Hegemony, the influence. And in my caution to all of us that educators acknowledge and accept that Euro-American education is a model that is about colonialism and about designed to shape and assimilate students and not necessarily to inspire them to doing higher things themselves. Okay, there's the Bozeman Library. You don't need to see that, and my experience in Southeast Asia. And now we're at Berkeley, and that's where you woke me up. Thank you. So I was first fortunate to happen into this program that combined anthropology, linguistics, education, cognition, and psychology all in one program. And it really did open my mind. And so when it was time for me to do PhD research, I found myself down at Crow Agency in August when Crow Fair was going on. And now I have to find my way back into my notes here. Yeah, so in attempting to embark on this independent research, I wound up here at Crow Agency. I knew that's where I wanted to be with that multilingual setting and the experience from my grandparents. And the first thing I did was to meet with Joe Medicine Crow, who was the head of the Crow Culture Committee. And he blessed me and sent me to see Superintendent Anderson in order to be able to have some access to children in the schools. And when I met with Superintendent Anderson, he said to me, we don't allow researchers in our schools, but he turned around and offered me a job. And so I can tell you that he was a smart man. He'd been a Navy pilot in Vietnam, but he described the language, the Crow language, as a dull tool. He thought that it was quite unlike French or German that kids might be able to get some real good use out of someday, maybe in the world of international business. And it took him some time to come to appreciate the Crow language. But after we had worked together for many years, he did come around to understanding how much more a language means to its people and its centrality to one's sense of self, as well as its importance in the developmental processes in education. He was not the only naysayer. At the time, the principal at Crow Agency School had issued a moratorium against teachers using even a single Crow word in the classroom. She was really adamant about it. To her, it took time and attention away from English, which was, in her belief, what the children really needed. So do you sense hegemony here again? Certainly powerful people and powerful forces. So we had some deep philosophical differences from the very start. The Hardin School District served 3 towns. I was assigned here at the Crow School. And there was just a very small bilingual staff of 2 people left that were running the program that had turned from an earlier dream of primary reading in the Crow language to now translating English fairy tales into Crow and then trying to teach them that way. To my way of thinking, this was classic hegemony, that word again, and not at all bicultural. So it was evident we had significant pedagogical differences as well as the philosophical differences. To me, bilingual education was studying big ideas, using words that you understand, certainly not trying to learn English fairy tales just because they were translated into your own non-European native language. And then looking at the premise of the American public education system on the left of this slide, you can see that it's about imparting the 3 R's. It's always been about reading, writing, and arithmetic. And it's always been about rudimentary social skills. I mean, that's why we teach children that they can't run in the hallways and so on, and to prepare them for the world of work as they get up in the grades. It's also to instill cultural norms and democratic values, myths, and creeds of American life, which you will recognize as all having come from Europe and not other places in the world. The bilingual education, on the other hand, has to do all of the same content, the imparting of the reading, writing, arithmetic, and probably some of these other things, but it also has to teach English as a second language, and it has to have the time to be able to teach it. Yeah, gotta change my notes here. So the Crow Agency model. In this milieu, I was called upon to develop a new, more authentic instructional design. I guess maybe I should interject here that what had happened in the interim was that there had been a group of people that had developed a really fine program, but it met with so much disapproval from the community and from other people inside the school district that it got disbanded. And the federal government at the time had made the choice to move a grant that it had funded in another school district into the school district that I wound up in, because it was seen as having higher fiscal responsibility. And so there we were with Dr. Anderson accepted this money, but really didn't know what to do with it. And the staff had all dispersed, gone away. And so we really were starting all over again. I drafted this instructional design, and where am I? Oh, we were very privileged at that time then, and then they gave me a lot of leeway because we were privileged to find a wonderful Crow teacher who was able to come in and write materials in the Crow language and demonstrate how to deliver instruction in the Crow language on real academic subjects, not on things like fairy tales. And I'm gonna, I may have to just stick with my notes because I keep getting off when I try to talk. The theory, I interject also that we also were able to find a master's degree curriculum person. And so the new materials that were developed were developed with significant authority. The theory behind this model was that comprehensive oral use of the Crow language at the earliest grades would provide a solid foundation of educational concepts in the language the child understood, while simultaneously expanding the child's natural development of that first language, thus providing a solid foundation for bridging into the second language without losing any meaning. Then reteaching the academic concept in the English language, while avoiding direct translation. And I think that's really important to not do direct translation, because that merely allows the student's mind to tune out and wait for the concept to be taught in the language that the child's familiar with. And it defeats the whole purpose of using two languages. Instead, reteaching the concept in the alternate language on a different day or at a different time would continuously build capacity in the second language. And the students should be unable to predict which language would first be used, so that they would really tune in. There would be interesting information in both languages, keeping kids tuned into the teacher. Engaging students in verbal participation. You guys, I think we're all using total physical response nowadays, but back then I had learned that technique in Germany, and it was quite new in the US. So it was a new concept to people to use the total physical response with lots of manipulatives that would motivate the learners to pay close attention during instruction, and thereby also engage the longer term memory storage system that has to have enough time for it to be able to occur. Finally, adding metacognitive observations produced through contrastive analyses of tricky elements of the Crow and English languages, as children were ready to comprehend those ideas, would be a bonus to the development not only of both languages and lead to greater cognitive flexibility for the students. In other words, research suggests that when you compare and contrast features of the two languages with the students, you're leading them into a higher level of thinking that monolingual children may not experience for many, many years. So that was the plan. Implementation was another matter for lots of reasons that we shall see. It developed slowly as people watched and remained skeptical. This annotated cartoon was left on the boardroom table for me, I suppose, one day after an administrative meeting. And basically, there was the high school principal had jotted in the names of all of the schools in the district and the superintendent's name at the time. And he'd added a little figure, if you'll see the frog on the lily pad, that was something that was added, and that was Crawley, that was me. And it was certainly representative of my being a little bit out on the sides, but kibitzing at them all the time, trying to get them to change their ways. So what else happens in the black box of education that can interrupt the ideas of how you might do any good program of instruction, I guess, is this business of identity development, and then followed by the development of power relations and maybe hardening into ideologies. And all of that, besides the thousands of non-trivial decisions that a classroom teacher makes every day, as we've heard Charlotte Danielson tell us. So, excuse me, identity development is that discursive process that works throughout maturation and builds upon feedback from those around us. So when children see themselves as successful, as I can be a reader, I can read, they're developing a positive self-image. And a proud Native American can be both a high school graduate and a proud Native American. Classic works in anthropology, I'm sorry. Classic works in anthropology and sociology suggest that children develop race and status awareness as early as the preschool years, and that babies' instinctual startle that response and crying that occurs at about 6 to 8 months of age when a stranger enters their space really is a mechanism that continues it's a protective mechanism that continues into adulthood. In other words, it's normal to be a bit fearful and to prejudge situations and people to assure your own personal safety. Normal growth and development leads to another, to another mental preoccupation, that of categorizing things. And as children love to do that, soon leads to a sense of in-group and out-group, classmates, community, etc. In the book, I quote kindergarten students who know, right, they like being Indian because Indians like them. So already at kindergarten, they had developed that sense of racial awareness and discrimination. Discriminatory power relationships may become established in the classroom if not deterred by the adults. And so hiring the right teachers or certainly the right administrators is really an important thing to do. Discriminatory ideas may then harden into ideologies that get handed down through generations. This is another big word, I guess. So ideology is just orthodoxy. It's doing things the way they've always been done. And it goes hand in hand with our, ideology and hegemony go hand in hand. And our ideologies are those exceptionally strong beliefs. That I had this wonderful example that I heard one time about an ideology. And so I'm gonna tell it here and you'll understand the, the reason for that silly slide of a chunk of meat. The classic example is the one about cutting the ends off the roast. The husband asks his young wife why she cut the good meat off at the end of the roast before she put it in the oven. She answers that her mother always did that, and not one to let it go. Her husband asks the mother-in-law why she cut the end off the roast. Mother-in-law says, oh, because it was just too big for the pan. And yet it had gone on into the next generation. So doing things just because that's the way they've always been done is familiar. We recognize that syndrome in ourselves and in the teachers teaching the way they were always taught, while being slow to adopt newer, better pedagogies just because that's not the way it was done. Unfortunately, ideologies can also become the basis and rationale for types of discriminatory behavior. I guess I got ahead of myself here a little bit. There's a wonderful paper in the child development literature that goes all the way back to 1970, so you can tell when I first came across it. And it's it was written by Baratz and Baratz, and it's one in which they contrast earlier works that had described poverty children as verbally destitute and linguistically underdeveloped. The Baratz suggested that a failure to change this old thinking would doom interventionist programs like Head Start to failure, and that it also constituted a form of institutional racism. 50 years on, as our nation struggles with racism and white supremacy, we are still dealing with the same kind of thinking. But back to our Crow Agency example now. Crow-speaking classroom aides were hired expressly to use their Crow language as part of the bilingual model. Yet getting compliance was at times difficult. For many of these aides brought with them a stereotyped conviction that English is for school, and they were bloody well going to use English. It was hard to change that attitude. Parents, yeah, I keep getting ahead. I think I'm ahead. Parents, parents were divided about using the Crow language at school. They wanted to have it, but they also knew that English was important. Teachers were incredibly fearful that their students would not be ready to make the great leap to middle school, which also coincided with them having to transition into the all-white, well, it's not all-white, largely white community, which is where the middle school and high school were. Grandparents and elders were firm in their desire to see the Crow language be maintained, and many thought bilingual education was a good thing. The sad part is how few understood that you could have both in the classroom and that both languages could be developed, and that would become a significant benefit to the child's intellectual development. And in all of this diverse opinion, some members of the white community were quietly looking to the school to lead in de-escalating the discrimination. This was an insight that I gained retroactively upon reanalyzing some of the community survey work that we did. And indeed, it was about that time that a cross-racial group of people filed a voter rights lawsuit against Bighorn County, and yes, they won. It was also about that time that the annotated cartoon that I showed you before appeared on the boardroom table. But discrimination aside, there were plenty of other challenges in the classroom. And now we get to the unique status of Native American languages in bilingual education. And frankly, this is part of the reason that I entitled the book the way I did, because I know that Crow bilingual education is not the only Native American education, but it was to distinguish Native American education from like Hispanic language bilingual education, because of the difference between Indo-European languages and non-Indo-European languages. Okay, give me just a second for a drink of water. And so I know that probably those of you who are with me today totally understand the array of major language families in the world, and that within each family there are lots of different languages that we think of as foreign languages in our French, German, Spanish, etc. But they're actually all structurally very closely related, and they were no doubt descended from the same group of original speakers. And that that languages, though the Native American languages, which did descend from totally different linguistic origins, there's not a whole lot of research on exactly how that happened. There's some, I know there are some folks that are saying that Sino-Tibetan, which is Chinese Tibetan, may be related to a couple of the Native American languages like Navajo, Athabascan languages. But beyond that, I'm not aware of a whole lot more research having been done in that area. And I'd love to hear it from the others of you if you're familiar with it. So The implications, however, for all of that are that that it creates huge stumbling blocks for teachers and their students, because the rules of grammar in Native American languages show little resemblance to English. While observing students in their classrooms, I collected data on problems in English and everything from prepositions, verb and tense construction, to word order and conditional clause formations. What follows are some of the examples of how these linguistic issues impact instruction. For example, now where am I? I think this is critically important. I guess it is in this slide here, that Crow phonics is very different from English phonics. So when teachers are spending class time teaching English phonics, which is no doubt just in their mandated reading series that the district has adopted, and so they have to use it, but that teaching that phonics isn't working with the young Native American speaker because the systems are so different. Prepositions in Crow are actually postpositions. Third person pronouns in Crow do not distinguish among he, she, it, him, her, they, them. And Crow word order also differs as the object precedes the verb, unlike in English, where which is the opposite. Did I say that strangely? Crow word order also differs as the object precedes the verb, unlike English, which is the reverse. Also, the system of color terms is a little bit different. So all of this was a challenge for the staff, let alone for the native Crow speaking students. And if you wanted to get a really good chuckle about prepositions, take a look at page, I think it's page 63, where I repeat a little bit of a poem that a TESOL teacher wrote one time about English prepositions. And I tried to turn it into a tool to use, like a test. And it was, you get a chuckle because it was a real failure. One way to enhance instruction in these circumstances, though, is a language-rich environment, in this language-rich environment is by analyzing the structural differences between the languages using contrastive analysis. That is, teaching children what to expect or how to approach problems before or as they arise. I offer a couple of examples here, and you could refer to chapter 3 for more, but you may also want to take a look at the Ebonics discussion in the book. If you, the whole big disagreement over Ebonics, I think, is what wound up making contrastive analysis fall out of our study about how to work with second languages. And then, of course, what do you do if the language that you're using, that you're working with, doesn't include the concept of zero? Well, clearly, you have to teach the concept of zero. And I can assure you that there are not very many adopted text series that include teaching that. I also absolutely believe in manipulatives in the classroom. I think they're a critical kind of play for what we call active learning play, and that they should really be the bulk of the work done in preschools. It's a simple but masterful tool for a child's natural language development process. Instead of reading words and memorizing vocabulary items, give children figures of people and animal, livestock, and playhouses, matched if possible to what's going on in the science curriculum or the social studies unit at that time. And math concepts using Cuisenaire rods and connecting blocks for counting, adding, subtracting, dividing, and multiplying. These can be manipulated, and this would be another caution of mine, is that they should be being manipulated by the children. While the children listen to the teacher or the aide in the classroom, but not that the teacher is instructing them what to do, but the teacher is merely saying the things that the child is doing. You putting words to the actions of the child, and modeling the language for them. And then you'll know when the kids have got it, when they start using it themselves. Crow social studies and other cultural activities, such as learning about the clans and the clan system. Crow social studies and other cultural activities, such as learning about the clans and the clan system, how the buffalo provided for the people, or about the history and performance of a specific dance, were always to be led by Native teachers. Two more thoughts. One is be wary of the closed procedure. So many of our textbooks now use the closed procedure where they'll blank out some words in a sentence and then expect the child to fill in those words. When you're working with multiple languages, that becomes a way abstract expression and very difficult for them to do, and not, frankly, doesn't teach anything. I'm also really concerned when I see a closed procedure used in examinations. That's high performance stuff, and I guess I should call it, it's high stakes stuff, and it's really irrelevant for the kind of things that most exams are trying to achieve. And then I guess last but not least here is the whole notion of English class. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. So often in bilingual settings, when you have a bilingual student come into a school that, excuse me, that's not really set up for bilingual education. I should say, when you have a speaker of another language come into a school that's not set up for bilingual education of any kind, the principal will think, well, the obvious thing is to put that child in the English class because they're going to learn English. And that's a fallacy also, because modern English, modern day English classes in middle school, high school don't teach English as though it were a second language. They teach all kinds of things about literacy, but not specifically about how to be a second language learner. Okay, a really fun aspect of the program while I was at Crow Agency, and the things that we got to do, was this whole business of developing Crow language materials, not only for native language literacy for the students and for teacher training, but also for the opportunity to preserve these cultural treasures. And so I'm going to show you a little series here of some of the more advanced books that were developed. And I think I'm really drawn to these books myself, because they were stories that were told by some of the oldest living members of the Crow tribe at the time that our staff were collecting them. This one was written up by Marlene Mockingbird, and it was a story that her grandfather used to tell around the fire in the wintertime in her childhood. And this is another traditional story, the story of With Grandmother. I'm not going to go into detail, I guess, about who told the story and all of that, but it was a story of a powerful and evil people who had faces on both sides of their heads. And this story about Lodge Lining and Spring Boy is another traditional story. Some of these books are not translated even into English, and so they're really pretty advanced. This one as well, the story, The Legend of the Horned Toad. But then we also had staff members, native Crow-speaking staff members, who chose to develop some contemporary stories. And we had some really cute little books that were for the younger grades, K through 3, that were like this one about the escapades of this woman's 7 children. And another aspect of the program was our community outreach. I guess I spent a lot of my time in this endeavor doing everything from these newsletters, calendars that were based on things that we wanted the community to understand about bilingual education, woven into things like, I must have a picture of it here. Woven in, things like Plains Indian heritage. And we conducted open houses where we would invite the parents and teachers from town to come and see what was really going on in bilingual classes. and children wrote work. We were able to bring in outside poets that would help the children begin to express themselves in meaningful ways. And then their work would get, because we had the Materials Development Center there, we were quite readily able to print their work. And so I think it was real beneficial for the kids. Oh, and then I have to tell you about we did take Crow speaking children to the legislature one session, and we found that the legislators were totally surprised that there were so many kids in Montana who did not come to school speaking English, because for them, they thought that all bilingual education was for a Mexican migrant worker program. So I did, I spent one weekend with a candy basket and handouts about what bilingual education was in the mall in Billings, talking to people, trying to catch their attention. And if they deigned to talk with me, I found that they were fairly easily convinced when they heard what the program was really about. But while we're talking about powerful forces and outreach, I should mention that I was shocked that Newsweek magazine, which was one of the two primary news magazines at the time, there was Times and Newsweek. Newsweek chose to not ever cover a bilingual education story in their magazine. So talk about powerful forces. And then I'm going to switch to laws and policies and how they encode public opinion and embed those language ideologies that we were talking about. And sometimes they force change. So there were lots of policy shifts. I think this will take us to it. Over the years that I was involved in this program, and we all know, and we've certainly seen it very vividly in the last few years, how much a change in political party can change. I'm trying to see what. I cannot. Yep, that's what I was afraid of. I was trying to see how much time I had left. And at my age, I have to wear two different sets of glasses to be able to do that. Okay, getting back on track. As the political parties changed, there were shifts in everything. And sometimes there would be a significant lag between what one end of the continuum was doing and what another end of the continuum was doing. So I think it's important for some people to recognize that Congress actually provides the direct authority for those funding streams. And so when they say that something's going to, when they put strictures on it, they certainly can do that. Oh, okay, here we are. Hold on just one second while I try to gather my thoughts here again. So I guess what I was trying to say is that the local federal grantee, those programs are at the absolute whim of the political officials. And very few of the political officials are actually familiar with what goes on in a classroom in education. So there was clear evidence that the Reagan administration of the 1980s, that they did not support bilingual education. And Reagan's education secretary deliberately cut the funding by more than half as part of the trickle-down economic theory. And at about that same time, the administration changed the regulations disallowing balanced bilingual programs, which was basically the kind of program that we were running. And instead, they turned it into a ESL only program, and you can only use the native language until you can push the kids into all English. And that was they did this without addressing the time that it takes for individual learners, the variety, how different it is for different kids, how long it takes them to become proficient in the English language. I know there are people that feel like bilingual education was the one that did that, but it really wasn't bilingual education. It was interpretation at the federal level. I'd have to say, and then after this, that local opinions continued to vary. Parents remained divided throughout the years, but generally tribal elders, here we are, beautiful woman that I think so fondly of. Tribal elders' opinions about using the Crow language remained firmly in favor. They told program staff absolutely riveting stories of their own educational experiences. The Crow language and their land were an uppermost priority for them, and they often suggested that if they lost the language, they might also lose the land. The language is deeply embedded in their psyche. So, and it took, where am I? Nope, that's where I wanted to be. It took the school board of that school district that had first started bilingual education in 1970. It took them until 1986 to adopt this policy and actually put it in writing in their policy book. In accordance with the philosophy of developing the abilities of each student, the district offers appropriate instructional programs for limited English-speaking students to include, but not limited to, instruction in English as a second language, bilingual Crow English content, area instruction, and Crow literacy. So by 1986, Reagan had slashed all of these opportunities, and now the local school board finally puts its support behind them. It was quite an interesting shift. And then I want to turn to Denise Juneau. When a Native American woman is elected into the superintendent of public instruction position in the state of Montana, one of her first acts was to get the legislature to commit to funding the new constitution, actually, that was written in the 1970s, and get them to fund the cultural heritage of Montana's Native American citizens that was in that constitution, get them to fund it for the first time. And we got what's known as Indian Education for All, and that has been making wondrous improvements in the education in our schools in Montana ever since. That only took 30 years. And then soon thereafter, Crow legislator Sharon Paragoy, who was an experienced bilingual administrator herself, asked me if I would help secure funding in support of the constitutional protection for Montana's Native American languages. And I was back in Montana at that time. I'd been out of state for a few years, but I was back, and I was pleased to be able to help to get the right people into the room, even if it was a back room, for her to be able to get the first Montana Indian Languages Act passed. And that's what we heard about from Jonathan Wendyboy at the last session of this. Okay, where am I? So I've done a little graphic that you'll find in the book, and what I've tried to do is to weave in some of the outer circle of forces that make up public opinion and show the pendulum swings of public policy in the force and counter forces of social movements, court decisions, congressional edicts, and academic research, and how those all push and pull one another. My chart begins in the 1950s with the social control exercised by the Ku Klux Klan that was in turn repressed by the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education that ended separate but equal and supported school integration. That was followed by sociological deficit theories that you heard some of my favorite researchers, Baratz and Baratz, talk about way back here. That Black and brown children lived in deprived circumstances that were the cause of underperformance at school. The counter to that one came in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and Congress took several important actions passing civil rights laws and the Equal Education Opportunity Act, as well as the Bilingual Education Act, with the encouragement of President Johnson, who himself had been a teacher in a poverty school in Texas. So we know that personal experience really matters. And then Native Americans won the Bighorn County voter rights case, and that was followed by a resurgence of KKK activity that coincided with the National English Only movement and eventually the death of the Bilingual Education Act in 2002, long after President Reagan's administration had tried to starve it to death by severely cutting its funding. So in those last years of its existence, there just was not very much federal money at all, and school districts had to pick up the bulk of the work with whatever funds they could cobble together to do it. Now, assessing outcomes can be summed up in my estimation from this program as immeasurable successes and unsuccessful measures. While trying to measure official outcomes with standardized test results, it left a bit to be desired. But watching children's positive self-image grow as they learn that their language can do all the same things that any other language can do, seeing them commit their thinking to writing in either Crow or in English, to printed books, and to share their stories orally before large audiences was certainly immeasurable success. This Tribune photo of the first class to graduate in Great Falls that was allowed to wear their honor feathers is another story for another time. But for me, that's another success. And then I know I probably don't have any time left, but I did insert a small chapter in this book about the change process and about how to manage change processes in complex organizations, and to get continuous improvement efforts going. This change process, I should hasten to add, is that not to force cultural change on children and their families, but alternatively to alter internal belief systems among school personnel, in this case about language and its role in life and education, in hopes that policy shifts may make life easier for those who follow. Given war, poverty, genocide, and the mass movements of people around the globe today, schools absolutely need to retool to be able to meet this growing challenge. And all those dangers, all those powerful forces that led to the political demise of the Bilingual Education Act are still with us and are being resurrected in virulent form today. So that concludes my prepared remarks, other than this several pages I have of do's and don'ts that I've summarized. And I have to turn to Ioana and ask if she wants me to proceed, if we have enough time for that, or if we should do that a different way.
Cheryl, I think if you'd like to take some questions now and then we can share it. Does anybody have any comments or questions for Cheryl right now? Or should we go ahead and hear her do's and don'ts?
I'd just like to share a little story, if I could, that really made a difference to me. My name is Dottie Susag. I now live in Minnesota, and I see some people I've known for a long time. So welcome to this group, and I'm very thankful to be here. We were doing some research into the history of the local community in the Sun River Valley. And one of the women that we communicated with the most was 103 years old. And she was German. And probably 10 years old at the beginning of World War I. And so they were homesteading there in the valley. And they spoke German all the time at home. And there was a man who was German who had brought his sheep down and was going to take them along the railroad tracks to go north to graze. And he was beaten up in one of the bars along the Sun River. And she came home, and the father said their prayers in German like they always did, because they always spoke German at home. And he said to her, to the family, "This is the last word of German that will be spoken in this house." And almost 95 years later, this woman who had lived through much said, "That was the worst day of my whole life." So it really hit home to me about the, how important language is in shaping who we are and forming the community that we grow up in. And so it has made me much more sensitive, I think, to the problems that Native kids have when they come to, or any. I have 2 grandchildren here in St. Paul who are in a Hispanic Spanish immersion school. And a lot of the kids came as native Spanish speakers. So they have teachers who are Spanish teachers who are, so having the Spanish speaking teachers in the classroom is really, really critical. These kids, my grandkids, of course, aren't Spanish, but they are learning it, and it's on an equal basis.
Mm-hmm.
I could really. And then I wanted to say one more thing. Gerald Gray is here. And I still remember something when I went up to interview teachers and tribal people on the Blackfeet Reservation. I spoke with Harold, your brother, is that right?
Are you? Oh, you.
Is he unmute? Can he unmute?
Oh, you must be muted.
No, he's my twin brother.
Yes, yes. And did he pass away?
He did.
Yes, and I wanted to tell you how sorry I was that, because the things that he said to me were very, very important as I began my work. So
Yeah.
that's all I wanted to say.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crawley.
That's such a good story, and that it. I sometimes wonder if we would be better off now if more people had continued using their languages and being much more bilingual. But I think well, obviously it didn't stop my grandmother from speaking German, but you also know, maybe you don't, that Montana had a Sedition Act, and a lot of people, I don't know how many people it was, fewer than 20, I suppose, people that went to jail because their neighbors or somebody thought of them as being seditious because they were speaking the German language during the Second World War.
Right.
Ace, did you want to add something or ask a question? Comment?
No, I just I really liked the presentation, and yeah, I think there's a lot of good content there. So I just wish to extend that thank you to Cheryl Crawley for everything that you've covered today.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I apologize that I am not being a very good speaker today. We'll try again.
I'll hone in, especially I think I really liked the breakdown of like the phasing of teaching at different grade levels and different percentages of different languages at each of those different stages. I think that's an interesting one for me. I've never seen before, and yeah, it just gives some room for thinking on how to keep students engaged while still building on different language sets over time.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, thank you for sharing that. That was new.
For those of you that aren't familiar, the Sedition Act had 40 men and 1 woman imprisoned here in Montana between 1918 and 1920 for speaking German.
Thank you, Iwana. You're right. And the reason I was thinking that it was fewer than 20 was that that's how many were still alive when Governor Schweitzer commuted their sentences just very, very recently.
Do you want to share your do's and don'ts then, and then we can continue the conversation? Cheryl?
Yeah, okay, I can't see, for some reason, I can't see any of our people who are participating, but now I see Lynn Hinch's face, so I know she's there. Hi, Lynn. Yes, Casey, if you're there, can you put it up on the screen? And what do I need to do to remove what I've got here?
Take care of it.
Oh, good.
Looks like Lynn has her hand raised. If you'd
She
like to
does.
ask a question or make a comment, Lynn, before we go on. You just have to unmute yourself.
I didn't know if that was working or not. I
We
was
saw
just thinking, yeah, when you were talking about the Sedition Act and, you know, what you went through, Cheryl, in terms of laws, you know, there was a reinstitution, if you will, or a law that passed in the early 90s that Governor Roscoe signed that was essentially an English only law, but still on the books. Sharon Paraguay has been trying over multiple legislative sessions to have that withdrawn, or whatever the term would be. It has some language in about sort of exempting native languages, but nevertheless, it was an English language law that really was sort of imported from out of state, because that was popular in a lot of states at the time that were instituting English only laws. So we still have that.
Yep. Yeah, I actually was not aware of that one, so I'll have to look it up and read the text of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yes,
happened
since
while I was out of state.
1995. Yeah, here in Montana since 1995. And I think there's 31 states. Yeah.
that have adopted it. Yeah, and that's an interesting way that the politics works, is that you have these people in think tanks that develop these policies, and then they find people all around the United States that will carry that legislation to their local legislatures. And so it looks like it might be locally derived, but it isn't actually. They tend to come from a single source.
And I remember the testimony against that was overwhelmingly against. Lots of people testified, Native people, Native language teachers. I think McFadulo testified, lots of people, but it passed without any problem.
Yeah, it sounds innocuous on its surface. So yeah, yeah, I get it. Thank you, Lynn, for sharing. Casey, you got my do's and don'ts? Now, is there a way to enlarge that window?
Yeah, here.
This, what I'm about to share with you is really kind of my nuts and bolts. A lot of this has developed through my years in education administration after being a bilingual education director. So it involves wider breadth of things. Okay, I guess I can see it, that's fine. And I'm gonna try to read it from there too. Do be aware that many factors mitigate against high school completion for Native American students. Some of my thoughts on that subject are that contrary to many white minds and eyes that see reservation life as impoverished and dysfunctional, hence the many historic attempts to relocate Native Americans to the cities and so on, this thinking is what is known as the sociological deficit model. On the other hand, reservation life can be a major source of development of power and personhood. It is rich, rich in family, tradition, ritual, and that ephemeral and stabilizing sense of place. Structural racism and discrimination can come from the hegemony of education laws, policies, and practices that fail to recognize legitimate differences in students' circumstances and family histories of negative experience with education, or fear of peer group alienation. What I mean by that is when some students don't want their peers, they don't want the people around them to know that they're really taking their studies seriously. And all of these have played a role to constrain educational attainment. Now, I don't know how to scroll. Yeah, children and parents' responsibility to family and tribal activities can supersede that of attending school. But the embedded levels of belonging, the dense network of family relations always takes one in. So while the immutable draw of the reservation is hard for outsiders to understand, it can be a very safe cocoon for its people. And moving on to school attendance and credit issues. It was not until the 2015 Montana legislative session that we were able to fix the problem of credit denial on the basis of seat time. As one parent said to me in 1980, this 10-day rule is a bit harsh. And many young Native Americans have failed to graduate after losing a semester of credit due to absenteeism. And that's no longer the case, unless people, unless people turn it into a case. I'm still trying to get a full page here. Maybe it doesn't matter. Yeah, I'm not sure where, okay. Okay, also be aware of how teachers feel disrespected when they perceive that children or parents or families are not making school a priority. Teachers work very hard to make their classes exciting and productive for the children. There's a sense of being let down when they feel that this is not appreciated by others. And I cannot reach the child who is not here is often heard. But of course, there are other ways of teaching children who have attendance issues. You can, nowadays we can Zoom with them, but not when this was written, not even a year ago, you couldn't do that yet, but there's still lots of ways of getting children caught up, getting lessons home to children, and just working with their circumstances instead of throwing your hands up in the air and saying, I can't teach them if they're not here. Do recognize children's strengths. Allow children to succeed. For example, teach school rules such as not running in the hallways and demonstrate what paying attention looks like. For example, through eye contact, before holding expectations for behavior that meets your own cultural expectations, but not necessarily those of your students. And that's always been an important factor for me, is to make sure that the school rules are well understood before they're enforced, and before children are, for heaven's sake, before children are punished for not doing something that is just not in their makeup. Race in America is a social construction, as physical anthropologists have widely demonstrated. Race is not a category of biological construction. It is developed and perpetuated based on people's perceptions of one another. While skin color is often the first thing noticed, the perception of race is often initiated by the language or dialect that is spoken. Fear is a huge factor in schools. Children cannot learn when their amygdala is on high alert. The amygdala is that reptilian base of the brain where actions occur before they have gone through the thinking process of the frontal cortex. We think of it often as the fight or flight reaction, or what happens when one jerks their hand away from a potential burn. So if a child has a post-traumatic flashback for whatever reason, and that happens during instruction, maybe it's something the teacher said, maybe it's something else that went on in the classroom, maybe something's happening outside the window, the brain will not take in the teacher's material if the kid's been hijacked by their reptilian brain. So you can't teach a kid that's not with you. High school English class does not teach English. I think I mentioned this one earlier. Principals consistently want to place non-English speakers in English teachers' classes. Foreign language class might be a better bet. Mathematics introduces yet another language in the classroom. I say you can see page 76 in the book. My recommendation, multilingual schools must develop the language of mathematics in early preschool and primary grades, so children are ready and proficient with the use of that vocabulary before the math problems and processes are introduced. If you're trying to do mathematics and the kids don't understand the language, they are not going to understand how math works. And then judicious discipline. There's actually a book that was written that's entitled Judicious Discipline. It's written by a professor that I knew in Oregon. I used to bring him in to do trainings in the schools because he so got it. Was teaching the rules above, it says teaching the rules above for elementary students, but judicious discipline is really about older students and analyzing why something is happening and address it in the least threatening way possible. So often, I mean, one of the things that he used to point out was that if you're analyzing data about when you have disciplinary incidents occur, and you discover that most of them are around the just before the lunch hour or something, you can pretty well guess that you maybe needs to make a different arrangements for how you release kids to go to the lunchroom so that you can avoid those kinds of problems. It's as simple as that. For secondary students, hold administrative hearings that involve the students' family members and the school in problem solving instead of rushing to board expulsions. Hearings conducted by the superintendent carry weight with the student, with the family members, his teachers and principals as they engage in solving problems around the table, and board expulsion can almost always be avoided. Remember that an expulsion puts a student out on the streets and out into society with few appropriate skills for survival in modern America. And then I totally support the Montana Class 7 licensure for non-traditional teachers of native languages. So do use that licensure. Get Indian teachers into the classrooms and Indian leadership into the executive suite, because, you know, folks, we don't know what we don't know. And you have to have the diversity in the room in order to have them be in a position where they feel like they can say something and speak up. And then the rest of us learn something, and then we can make changes that are appropriate. Avoid misdiagnosis of language difference or dialect as developmental delay or pathology. Something on the order of 9 to 12% of students would benefit from special education diagnoses and services. And far too many Native American children are labeled with learning disability for language issues that emanate from another language, from language or dialectal differences in the student's family and community, and not at all because there's is a pathology there that requires special education. Alternatively, roughly 20% of children meet gifted and talented criteria, and children from all language groups will benefit greatly from in-class differentiation or other gifted and talented services. Make sure language is not preventing Native American and other students from qualifying for gifted instruction. Make sure that the tests are not language-based and that some children are ruled out because of that. This also works for children with culturally different learning styles. Note the similarities between an introverted learning style and the learning by watching, which is a traditional Native American style of teaching and learning that's clearly related. Language arts. Do teach English as a second language. Do use contrastive analyses between the languages. Teach sentence constructions, verb conjugations, and especially the art of the embedded sentence or subordinate clause. I can't emphasize enough how much that throws people off if they don't understand about embedding sentences in other sentences. Learning the language of grammar can help teachers. It's something that for a long time didn't get taught in classes at school. And so very few people I find know the grammatical cases of nominative, accusative, genitive, subjunctive, or call it the noun, the object, the possessive, and so on. But just being able to talk about the parts of language is elevates the discussion so that you can understand what's going on there. Where am I? prepositions I found, okay, I'm back to my prepositions. I may have to read you a little piece of that. If I can find my book. Prepositions I found were among the most difficult, or one among the greatest difficulties for Crow-speaking children. Page 63. This, what I'm going to read you is from a poem that a teacher who has, was a college professor who has since passed away, but he wrote this for and published it in a TESOL journal a long time ago, Teachers of English and Speakers of Other Languages. And with my old eyes, I have to have different glasses to be able to read to you. So this is called Rooms. And it is, there are rooms to start up in, rooms to start out in, rooms to start over in, rooms to lie in, rooms to lie about in, rooms to be lied about being lied about in. Excuse me, I didn't say that one right. Rooms to be lied about being lied about in, rooms to lay away in, rooms to lay up in, rooms to lay over in, rooms to lie low in, rooms to lie about being laid up in, and rooms to be put up in, and so on and so on. Anyway, that is just replete with prepositions, and it shows, it demonstrates how English language uses them in a way that's not similar in some other language structures. Okay, I think that's the end of my do's and don'ts. Joanna, are you there to wrap us up?
Yes,
my
thank you. No, I'm still thinking about all the do's and
Oh.
don'ts. And I think about how, if you've not studied a second language or aren't a multilingual person yourself, I find it's really difficult for people to understand the parts of speech as a native speaker. So, doing contrastive analysis or even pointing out what case you're in seems like a lot to ask of our teachers.
Yes, it is a lost art, I'm sorry to say, unless you're a foreign language teacher.
Yes, yes. I just have one last question myself. I'd really like to know from the students that were part of your bilingual program, because I saw that the Bueno Center, which I worked for many years with Dr. Leonard Baca, he's my
Are you
mentor.
serious?
Yes, for
That's
25
wonderful.
years I worked with Leonard. And I'd love to know during the height of bilingual education and the fact that you had even James Crawford visit Crow, and I'd love to know what the students felt, because I saw some of the students that accompanied Mick Fidello up at MSU and how proud they were to share their poetry. And Dr. Little Bear constantly talks about how we still have not created fluent speakers. And I think Lanny Reelbird's presentation on how we're defining proficiency and fluency and what that all means, I think is something we have to consider for sure. But what were the students feeling going through your bilingual program? How successful did they feel, and how proud were they to be learning and working in both their Crow language and in English? I think that it was fabulous for them. That's why I use that immeasurable successes example, is because a lot of this you could just see in their everyday activities, and how much they were benefiting from it, and how positive and responsive they were, and it was beautiful to watch, truly. I have another diagram that I didn't put in this PowerPoint, but that follows the proportion of people who are speaking the Crow language in over time, from the 1950s to up to the end of I think even a little beyond the end of the Bilingual Education Act. And it starts with, in the 1950s, there were still signs in the windows in Hardin, in the businesses in town, that said no dogs or Indians. And over time, as the tribe and the people got more and more power, it absolutely corresponds with the decline in the number of people that speak Crow.
And that is too bad. I mean, and I think that's been part of what the education system has done to these people. And it gets done by people who do not understand the cognitive flexibility and all the benefits to the brain that happen when you have multiple languages.
Mhm. Very, very difficult situation for sure. Anybody else have a last comment or question for Dr. Crawley? Lynn, your hand is still up. Did you have a question or you just can't get rid of your emoji?
That would be me. So Dorothea,
Yes.
would you introduce yourself?
What I,
Help me with
how?
how I should know
Am I,
you.
you want to know who I am?
Sure.
I don't know where I start. I've worked for OPI. I've worked for Humanities Montana. I'm a speaker in the schools.
Ah,
I had the Krista McCullough Fellowship in 92, 93 to write a curriculum for using native literatures in Montana schools, and it was published as Roots and Branches by NCTE. And my goal always is to go in as a Swedish Norwegian descendant, to always use native voices and to make sure that whatever I use is authentic and accurate as much as I can find. So I amassed a collection of hundreds of books that, and before we moved from Montana to Minnesota, I spoke with Walter Fleming. What am I going to do with all these books? I still have, I don't know, I suppose 100, 150 picture books and novels and nonfiction resources that I use in teaching. But he suggested that I give them to the tribes. So I divided them all up and they went to the tribal libraries. And but I don't know what I would have done without people like Harold Gray and Harold Dustyball, Blackfeet, and the Peace Sisters at the Crow Reservation, and then the librarians on every one of the reservations, and OPI and Lynn Hinch and Mandy, and oh my gosh, I still talk to Mike. So anyway,
yeah, Mike Chetty. Yes.
I am currently working in schools in Montana from here, and I've been teaching virtual classes.
Oh,
Boy, I know. I mean, I struggle with the PowerPoints and whatever. So I was in Bozeman February 2nd to do the keynote for the one book, one Bozeman,
oh.
Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I don't know, what else can I say?
Well, thank you. I don't see very many people on my screen here, but your face had come up, and I didn't recognize you, and so I'm very, very glad to hear about all you've been involved in.
And
Now-
then I wrote several units that OPI has published and
Okay.
being used in the middle school and high school. I think they're still using them. And then a collection of native poetry from Montana, Birthright, Born to Poetry.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the titles of these books, but I guess we've never met.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. So how did you start out? Did you start out as a teacher?
Oh yes, I was an English teacher, and then
Yeah.
I received that fellowship that was given to one teacher a year in honor of the Challenger accident, and
Yeah.
McCullough. That's what it was. And so Lois Welch was the head of the English department at the University of Montana. And I said, I'd like to write my master's thesis on an African-American author. And she said, what the heck do you want to do that for here? You need to work on Native authors.
Uh-huh.
So I began my research with Zikala Sa, and then studied under Deborah Erling and a whole bunch. So that was kind of the beginning, and then traveling all around to the or all around the state too. I don't want to take up too much of this, but I do want to say that in '92, when I went to each reservation high school and met with teachers to ask them, what literatures are you using that are written by Native people? When I went to Browning, the English department said, well, we teach the Song of Hiawatha. And I,
Almost like teaching European fairy tales.
that's exactly right. And then when I went to look at distributors of books for elementary level, 99 out of 100 books, and I'm wrong, I might have been 100, were all authored by non-Native people, all.
Oh.
So my goal in '93 was to expose teachers to books that Scholastic and whatever else had decided that and that they didn't meet their criteria, or they wouldn't be bought up, because the stories the Native people told were not the stories that the non-Native people were looking to hear.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so they wouldn't publish them. So I communicated directly with the head of Scholastic and at one conference, and I said, you don't have enough books out that are authored by Native people. What's going on here? And then
good.
I contacted him personally, and because he wasn't going to reprint a book by Joe Bushak that's a fabulous book. And so the next morning, Joe Bushak called me and said, you wouldn't happen to know about somebody from Montana who complained to Scholastic? Anyway, Scholastic had agreed to republish his book. So, I mean, if you rattle the cages, but it's...
Personal actions matter.
Yeah, they do. Anyway, I don't know what you wanted to know.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very kind, very nice to meet you. Thank you, Ioana, for putting us together.
Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Dr. Crawley, for presenting today. And we will have on March 24th from 2 to 3:30 that Wednesday, Dottie will talk about the Night Watchman. And
oh, good.
We'll have a follow-up session on April 7th as well. And Casey's working hard as always, trying to get our recordings out, because we know everybody's so busy. And if you don't have time to be here with us when we do the Zoom Live, we have recordings of all of the presentations in the CBME, the Center for Bilingual and Multicultural Ed's video library. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks. Dottie will be waiting for you. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.